You notice, after enough time has passed, that the things which remain are rarely the things that move fastest. Not the most daring ventures, not the quickest returns, not the institutions that promise the most or reach the highest. What remains is usually something quieter, something that understood from the beginning that the goal was never to arrive first, but to still be standing when the hurrying was over. This is not a lesson you can teach someone who has not already lived long enough to see it for themselves. It is something you come to understand by watching, by observing what happens when systems grow too quickly, when ambition overtakes judgment, when the desire for more becomes indistinguishable from the inability to recognize enough. I have spent much of my life in cities where finance is conducted with a certain kind of energy. Places where the pace itself is meant to communicate confidence, where speed is assumed to be a virtue, where standing still even for a moment is interpreted as falling behind. These places have their own logic, and for some people, at certain times in their lives, that logic makes sense. But I keep returning to Vienna, not because it offers anything that those other cities do not. The mechanisms are largely the same. The instruments, the processes, the fundamental mathematics of capital, all of this exists in Vienna just as it exists everywhere else. What differs is not the substance, but the manner. The way things are approached, the assumptions that guide decision-making, the relationship between time and judgment. Vienna does not move quickly. This is the first thing you notice if you arrive expecting urgency. Meetings are not rushed. Decisions are not made in the room where they are discussed, but afterward, once there has been time to consider what was said and what was not said. There is a formality to the interactions that can feel, at first, like inefficiency. But after a while, you begin to understand that this formality is not ornamental. It is structural. It creates space between impulse and action. And in that space, better judgment becomes possible. I remember once sitting in a wood-paneled office, the kind of room that could have existed 100 years ago and might exist 100 years from now, waiting for a response to a relatively straightforward question. The answer took longer than I expected. Not because the person I was speaking with did not know the answer, but because he was thinking about whether the answer might change depending on circumstances I had not yet mentioned. This is how things work here. Questions are not answered immediately because immediate answers are often incomplete. There is an understanding that complexity takes time to reveal itself, and that the appearance of simplicity is frequently misleading. In other environments, this would be seen as hesitation. Here, it is simply carefulness. And carefulness, when practiced consistently over decades, becomes something more than caution. It becomes a kind of architecture, a way of organizing thought and action so that extremes are noticed before they become commitments. The buildings themselves seem to reflect this quality, not grand in the way that announces wealth, but solid in the way that suggests permanence. Facades that have been maintained but not renovated beyond recognition. Entrances that do not invite passers-by, because the business conducted inside is not meant for passers-by. A certain reserve that is not unfriendly, but is also not trying to make you comfortable in the way that modern institutions often do. This reserve is part of the culture. It establishes, without words, that what happens here is serious. Not solemn, but serious. That capital is not treated as an abstraction or a number on a screen, but as something that represents years of work, of choices made and choices avoided, of discipline maintained over time. The people who manage this capital tend to think in similar terms. They are not trying to maximize every opportunity or squeeze additional percentage points from strategies that have already been tested to their limits. They are thinking about sustainability, about whether the approach being considered will still make sense in 5 years, or 10, or 20. This is not the kind of thinking that produces dramatic results. It does not generate the stories that circulate at gatherings or appear in publications devoted to finance. But it does generate something else: continuity. The ability to remain in operation through conditions that close other institutions. The capacity to weather difficulty without panic, without dramatic restructuring, without the kind of visible scrambling that erodes confidence even when it ultimately succeeds. There is a particular kind of relationship that develops between institutions and their clients when both are thinking across generations. It is not transactional, because transactions imply an ending. This is something more durable, an alignment of perspective, a shared understanding that what matters is not what can be achieved in the next year, but what can be preserved and, if circumstances allow, gently increased over the span of a lifetime. I have watched these relationships develop. They begin, formally, with the same reserve that characterizes everything here. But over time, as trust accumulates through consistency rather than promises, the formality softens into something closer to partnership. Not friendship exactly, the boundaries are maintained, but a mutual respect that comes from having observed each other through different kinds of conditions. When markets rise, there is no celebration. When markets fall, there is no alarm. There is simply adjustment. Small, measured changes that keep the overall position balanced, that prevent any single holding from becoming so large that its failure would be catastrophic, or so small that its success would be meaningless. This is balance as practice, not as theory. It is not a point you reach and then maintain effortlessly. It is something you attend to constantly, making tiny corrections that prevent larger ones from becoming necessary later. The pace of life in Vienna reinforces all of this in ways that are difficult to describe but easy to feel. There is time for coffee that lasts an hour, for conversations that circle around a subject before arriving at it, for meals that are not interruptions in the day's work but part of the day's rhythm. This is not leisure, exactly. It is proportion. An acknowledgement that human beings do not function well when everything is optimized for efficiency, when every moment must produce something measurable. The financial institutions mirror this understanding. Offices close at reasonable hours. There is rarely anyone working late into the evening, not because the work is unimportant, but because exhaustion does not produce better decisions. People take holidays, real holidays, where they are unreachable, because rest is understood to be part of competence, not opposed to it. This seems almost radical when compared to the cultures that have developed elsewhere. The assumption in many financial centers is that constant availability signals commitment, that working longer hours demonstrates seriousness, that rest is something you earn only after proving yourself indispensable. Vienna rejects this entirely. The assumption here is that people who are tired make poor decisions, that judgment deteriorates under strain, that the appearance of dedication means nothing if the quality of thought has been compromised. I think about the word moderation sometimes, and how it has come to sound almost apologetic, as if moderating yourself were the same as limiting yourself, as if restraint were evidence of timidity rather than wisdom. But moderation is not the absence of strength. It is strength applied with precision. It is knowing how much force a situation requires and refusing to apply more than that, even when applying more might feel satisfying in the moment. Vienna practices this kind of moderation in everything related to finance. Returns are acceptable, not exceptional. Growth occurs, but slowly. Risks are taken, but only after extensive consideration, and only when the potential loss can be absorbed without threatening the larger structure. This does not satisfy everyone. There are those who come to Vienna expecting something more dramatic, more innovative, more aligned with the aggressive strategies that dominate discussion in other places. They leave disappointed, or they leave and return only later, when they are older and their priorities have shifted, because that is what often happens. People spend the first part of their lives accumulating, and during that period, growth is paramount. The goal is to build something substantial, and that requires risk, requires ambition, requires the willingness to accept uncertainty in exchange for the possibility of significant gain. But there comes a point, for many people, when the priority changes, when preservation becomes more important than accumulation, when the question is not how much more you can gain, but how you can ensure that what you have will endure. Vienna is built for this second phase, for people who have already achieved enough that losing it would be worse than not gaining more. For those who understand that wealth is fragile, that it requires attention and care, that leaving it unattended or managed carelessly is often the beginning of its disappearance. The institutions here have been through periods when caution was unfashionable, when the world around them was moving in directions that seemed certain, when opportunities appeared so obvious that not pursuing them seemed almost irrational, when the conventional wisdom was that old approaches were obsolete and new methods had rendered traditional concerns irrelevant. Vienna did not participate in these moments with much enthusiasm, not because those running the institutions were unaware of what was happening, but because they had seen this pattern before. They had seen confidence turn to recklessness, seen certainty collapse into confusion, seen innovations that promised to change everything fade into irrelevance when their underlying assumptions proved incorrect. So they watched. They made small adjustments when those adjustments seemed prudent, but they did not abandon the principles that had allowed them to survive previous cycles. They remained balanced, even when balance appeared to be costing them opportunities. And then, inevitably, conditions changed. The opportunities that had seemed so certain revealed themselves to be more complicated. The methods that had promised revolution produced disruption instead. And the institutions that had moved most aggressively found themselves facing difficulties that those who had remained moderate did not face. This has happened more than once. It will happen again. The pattern is reliable even when the specific details differ. And Vienna's financial culture is organized around this recognition that patterns repeat, that human nature does not change as much as circumstances do, that what looks new is often simply a variation on something old. There is a quality to walking through certain districts of the city in the early evening, when the work of the day has finished, but the streets have not yet emptied. You see people leaving offices that do not announce what kind of work happens inside them. You see buildings that have stood for so long that their age is impossible to guess without research. You see a city that has absorbed centuries of change and yet remains recognizably itself. This continuity is not accidental. It is the result of countless small decisions made over time. Decisions to preserve rather than replace, to repair rather than rebuild, to maintain what works rather than constantly searching for what might work better. The financial system operates according to the same instinct. It changes, but it changes incrementally. It adopts new methods when those methods prove themselves through use elsewhere. It remains skeptical of anything that promises too much or requires abandoning too much of what already functions reliably. This skepticism is sometimes mistaken for rigidity, but there is a difference between being rigid and being deliberate. Rigid systems break when circumstances change. Deliberate systems bend. They adapt without transforming. They accommodate without losing their fundamental character. I have watched people discover this place at different points in their lives, and the timing matters enormously. Those who arrive young, eager, looking for acceleration, they often leave confused or frustrated. Vienna does not offer what they are seeking, and there is no shame in that. There are other places better suited to that particular hunger, but those who arrive later, having already experienced enough volatility to understand its costs, having already learned that not every opportunity is worth pursuing, they recognize something here that they have been looking for without quite knowing it. They recognize that there are still places where patience is valued, where long-term thinking is not just discussed but actually practiced, where the relationship between an institution and its clients is expected to outlast market cycles, economic shifts, changes in fashion and theory. These are the people who stay, who move capital here not because they expect it to grow dramatically, but because they trust it will be here when they need it, that it will be managed with the same carefulness they would apply themselves if they had the time and the expertise. This trust is not given easily, and it is not asked for carelessly. It is built slowly, through years of consistency, through doing what was said would be done, through avoiding the temptations that lead other institutions to compromise their stated principles when conditions make those principles inconvenient. As the light fades over the city, there is a kind of settling that occurs. Not silence, but a quieting. The urgency of the day, such as it was, releases its hold. What remains is the ongoing work, the patient tending to responsibilities that will still be there tomorrow and the day after and the year after. In the offices where capital is managed, where decisions are considered and relationships are maintained, this same settling occurs. The work does not end, because this kind of work never ends, but it pauses. It finds its resting point until morning, when it will resume at the same measured pace. There is something reassuring in this predictability. Not the reassurance of certainty, nothing is certain, but the reassurance of pattern, of knowing that the approach will not change based on mood or fashion or the anxieties of the moment. The city continues in its rhythms. The institutions remain at their posts. Capital moves through channels worn smooth by decades of use. And somewhere in the accumulation of all these small, careful actions, balance is maintained. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough that the system continues, that what was entrusted remains safe, that the work of preservation goes on without need for drama or declaration. The evening deepens, the stone facades hold the last of the light, and the quiet work continues, as it always has, as it always will, in the only way it knows how.